We're really excited to be able to be here at a partner University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and to share some of the work that we've done to really think about this topic that's the focus of today, of navigating transitions and really navigating those transitions to support people to lead the lives that they want and to be the person that are determining those lives. So Ben and I are going to work together today to try to share some examples from the work that we do at KUCDD, our center, really highlighting how important transitions and centering the voices and the self-determination of people with disabilities are in that process. We wanted to start by highlighting some of the core values that we bring to our work and that we want to share and communicate with everyone today. These are actually the values that guide our center that were co-developed with our advisory councils and other partners to really focus on the things that we want to be doing, which is high quality work, having clear purpose and vision, seeking diversity, including others, and having respect. And Ben, do you want to share how we try to actualize that and what we do?
Yeah, I can give one example. When we were doing a project called the Self-Advocacy and Goal Attainment Project, that was a project from some time ago, studying one of our interventions in a way it had not been done before. We were testing this intervention on autistic high school, college-age students, and this was a new thing, so we actively sought out and paid autistic voices for their participation. We had an advisory board that was of about, I think, 8 autistic adults that was led by myself and a colleague of mine together. And I just have to say, we just learned a whole lot that we wouldn't have learned if we were just doing things on our own. So I think that goes to show just one way that including others does make our work better and does allow us to do high quality work.
Yeah, and we're hopefully going to share a lot of examples as we go through the presentation today of how we're trying to do that. We'll be able to hit these slides quickly because Aben already did such a great introduction of us, but we did just want to highlight who we were and what we're bringing to what we're sharing today. Definitely. Ben, is there anything else you want to share about yourself?
No, can't really think of any. I have been sort of a de facto kind of unofficial kind of leader of what was once called the Kansas City League of Autistics and is now going through a whole phase of transition to being a group called Neurodiverse KC after kind of talk amongst its leadership and things like that. But I think we're at a kind of a point where we're going to really change our focus and we're going to do work that we kind of haven't been able to do for so long, and I'm kind of stepping back from a lot of my role in it, but it will, I think, 4 years of helping to get it back together have really paid off for all this and will lead it to a lot more fruitful ventures in the future.
Yeah, and we're really lucky to have Ben, as well as many other team members on our inclusive research team that really tries to bring forward lived experiences into what we do to bridge the advocacy community, the research community, and getting many of these strategies out in practice.
Right.
We do a lot of work with educators, a lot of work with other community partners to really make sure we're moving those things forward. And so, I'm Karrie Shogren. I have been very fortunate to be able to work in this area of trying to work in partnership with the disability community to advance self-determination for most of my career. Really, this idea of how do we empower people to be the drivers of their lives is what's essential to everything that I do, that Ben does, and that we seek to do through our center. So we hope to show you some of the strategies today that we've worked on developing over time that hopefully many of you might be able to take with you in your practice, in your research, in your daily lives, and benefit from. So what we're going to try to do today, in a relatively short period of time, we'll try not to talk too fast, but we might get excited, is we are going to first start by talking a little bit about what defines a meaningful life, how we can think about this, and how this is the ultimate outcome of thinking about transitions and navigating this path forward. We'll talk some about key predictors of meaningful transition. What have we actually learned from the research, but also from voices and lived experience? We're going to highlight some of the work that we do at KUCDD around promoting self-determination, and then end with talking about how important strengths-based inclusive research and practice are. And this idea of what makes life meaningful is so important to everything that we're going to talk about today. We wouldn't be talking about transitions and where we're trying to get if it wasn't to try to live the meaningful life that matters to us. But that's very individualized for everyone, right? I could flash some things up on the screen, lots of different areas that are important to a meaningful life. Some of these are going to resonate with some of you more than others, and everyone is able to define that. Do you want to talk a little bit, Ben, about some of the things that make you think about life as meaningful?
Yeah, I can think of, a few different things that have, given my life kind of the purpose and meaning it has. I recently, in the Lawrence area, I bought a house that was quite nice, and I needed a little work done and had enough room to fit my desires. It had a bigger yard than I expected, and I have a cat, and I have a job that I really enjoy doing. And outside of that, I see friends that I enjoy seeing and do things that I like doing. Those are things that I think make my life meaningful, and doing continually moving forward on goals that I have, because we talk a lot about goals in SDLMI and self-determination. Those are things that I tend to think of when I think of meaningful lives and what that means for me.
Yeah, and we're going to keep this word goals, and Ben mentioned the SDLMI. That is an acronym for the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction. We'll mention that again later. But how do we each ourselves, and how do we support people to set goals and identify what makes a meaningful life for them? And one of the ways that we think about this is through transitioning, right? We don't just wake up one day and have the meaningful life we want, right? It's a series of transitions over the lifespan. It's thinking about and planning for buying your first home, for figuring out how to support the pandemic cat to adjust to that first home, and to figure out what to do with that big yard. Ben's building a really cool Zen garden to take some of that space. So it's thinking about all of those goals. But each of those are transitions, right? To think about how we're going to get there, what's going to be effective. If we look at the definition of a transition, this is what the dictionary tells us. It's a change or a shift from one place to another. And we all have lots of transitions. I was saying this morning, it was a transition for me to get to California time. I was up at like 3:30 this morning because, it was later in Kansas. So that's a little transition. But we also have these bigger transitions as well. Do you want to share about some of the big transitions in your life, Ben?
Yeah, I can think of the time when I went from high school to college. I didn't have a car or a driver's license. And I was thinking of how I found the right fit for that fact, given the fact that there was a community college in my area that had a pretty reliable bus schedule and bus transportation. So it was during that time that I was able to do a lot of things that would later shape my life and give it the meaning that it has. The classes I took, the things I did outside of classes, and I guess there was also a time when I was moving out of a 4-year college and would be at home away from the dorm life. And so that was a transition. what I didn't do for a long time was I didn't really see a whole lot of friends for a long time, and I realized that was a normal thing for someone going through what I was going through. But over time, it's like, no, I like being in this house. I don't think I want to live next to, you know, only a couple feet down from a bunch of college students anymore, to be honest. To be perfectly honest, I like the fact that my place is not connected to anyone else's, not connected to any other building. I just think it's worth mowing a big lawn every week for that.
So that idea, though, that was a change in the
Yeah.
shift, going from being at home, going to the dorms,
Right.
going back home, apartments, and the loud college students that tend to live beside you in apartments
Yeah.
in small college towns like Lawrence, where we're from.
Right.
So navigating all those shifts and figuring out what those mean and planning for and thinking about these transitions is actually something that really is a focus. It's a focus of educational services and supports, but I would argue that this covers all kinds of areas. We talk about healthcare transitions, we talk about other transitions in life. So IDEA really focuses on the fact that we need to think about how to coordinate the activities and the supports to really get people through transitions effectively. But we really want to emphasize what Ben and I think is a really important part of this, and why we started with that idea of what meaningful lives mean, is that you have to have that vision for a meaningful life. Otherwise, what are you transitioning to? What are you thinking about? How are we really thinking about where we want to get in the future? And this starts from when we're young, to when we're going through school, to when we're transitioning out of school, going through college, getting jobs. Ben's navigated different types of jobs and different types of environments, and thinking about all of that.
Definitely.
And so we want to think about effective transition planning. And again, this can cover all areas of life. And I would argue that this is important for all of us. And it's especially important to make sure that we're supporting people with disabilities to be planning for these transitions. So we have a definition up on the screen of transition planning. And it's really, again, thinking about how we can be intentional, organized, and coordinated. It's one of the exciting things having so many different perspectives in this room. How do we bring together all of the supports that we can bring to bear to create meaningful lives for all of us and for people with disabilities that are living in our communities, and go on to have those lives that we want? So we really think about transition planning as planning that is beginning with that end of getting to a meaningful life in mind. So we want to be starting there with our planning. Also, and Ben's going to share a little bit about how it has to center the person in defining that meaningful life and really promote self-determination.
Yeah, I think, if you're people who have a disability, I think we really know our needs better than anyone else. I mean, we don't always know where exactly we're trying to go, or what exactly we're trying to do, or what exactly, we sometimes, like anyone, struggle with what's the next step in our lives, but we know things like how we learn, we know things like what we can do, what we can't do, what might overwhelm us, and what might leave us feeling so unchallenged. And I think this is the case with any individual, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. They know these things about themselves. And without getting anyone's input on what they need during the planning for a transition, I just think it's bound to go wrong. It's bound to go disastrously. And that is why, like Karrie said, we need to center the person in setting goals and transitioning and things of that nature.
Yeah, and we know this from Ben's voice and his lived experience. I'm sure many of you in the room are feeling like, I agree with what Ben's saying. We know ourselves and we want to be the drivers of that process. We also, though, know from research that empowering people during transitions is the best way to lead to positive outcomes. I know this is a big table on the screen. You probably can't read very many of those things, it looks like, in the back of the room. But what I will assure you is that this table lists a lot of areas from research that we know can really support and empower people to go on to have those meaningful lives that they want. And this is actually from the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. So if you jot that down, and we can share more about that later, you'll be able to find this predictor list. And so this identifies an array of skills, and we actually, in our work, highlight several of these. Ben already mentioned goal setting and how important it is to have goals that are propelling you forward. Also feeling empowered, so feeling like you're able to do the things that are important to you. Also up here is things like having family involvement and community involvement to support you in making those decisions and to move forward. And so we know that when we are really supporting people in transitions to be identifying those goals, to feel empowered to go after the lives that they want, that's going to lead to better outcomes. And so that's what's led to a lot of the work that we do that has really tried to identify ways that we can empower people with disabilities to lead us in advancing self-determination in their lives. And Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about why self-determination is so important?
Yeah, sure. Well, it just means, as I've said the phrase a couple times before, it means being in the driver's seat of your own life. You're not following someone else's goals or someone else's plan for your life. You're following a plan that may not necessarily turn out to be successful, but there's a learning curve in all of this. There's the fact that you're learning more about what it takes to be successful in your life and plans that you make, and that you may be living not your best version of a life that you chose, but it's sometimes so much better than living the best version of someone else's plan for you.
And so we have, over time, built definitions of self-determination so that we can all have a shared understanding of what we're striving for in supporting people to go after this outcome in their lives. So on the screen is the definition that we use in our work, which is that being self-determined means acting or causing things to happen in your life as you set and work towards goals. So this idea of acting and causing things to happen and having those goals that you're working towards. Now, Ben already mentioned, but I'm gonna kind of echo what he already shared, that it's not necessarily all about achieving the goals or that your actions are always leading to exactly what you think they're going to. Becoming self-determined and defining our meaningful lives is all about that journey. It's about trying things. How many of us have had a goal for ourselves in our future that we did not come close to achieving, but we learned a lot in the process? I'm surprised I'm not seeing all the hands in the room.
Oh, come on, everyone, be honest. Be honest, I know that.
Yeah, right? But it's that idea of trying and moving forward and causing things to happen and then learning from them that's so important. Sometimes we get a little bit overly focused on the outcome, or that we check this box, or that we did this thing, but that journey of learning to cause or make things happen in your life is really one of the things that we've identified as really important in our work.
Definitely.
And this is something, these are some quotes up on the screen from other people with lived experience of disability about what self-determination means to them. This first one, it's being able to talk about what you want in your life. It's being able to identify that meaningful life for yourself and set goals and dreams for yourself. And then the second quote has always been one of my favorites and a real driver of how we've developed our work over time. You have to go do something or you won't be anything at all. Again, it's not that you have to achieve something, but you have to be striving for those goals and going after them. And that's really what we think is a very important part of that transition process and meaningful lives. Going after things, testing them out, trying, figuring out if you like the apartment right beside the college students, or if you prefer your own house. Figuring out if you're a cat person, which Ben is, or a dog person, as I am. So it's navigating and trying those areas.
Definitely.
And so what we've done over time that's really been led by Ben and many of the other members of our team at KUCDD and our community partners is to figure out how to put in plain language some of these areas that we're really trying to focus on in promoting self-determination.
Right.
So we have this graphic up on the screen now that talks about decide, act, and believe. And this is really an area that we're thinking about. How do we support people to make those decisions about meaningful lives, to take actions and steps towards them, and then to really believe and feel like they're empowered to do this and that they have the supports. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this framework, Ben, and why it's important?
Well, I think it teaches you a lot about yourself, for one. I wasn't too surprised when I got the results. When I took the test, I think believe might have been my strongest, act might have been the second strongest, and I know believe was the strongest, but decide I am pretty sure was my weakest point. And, you know, it made me also realize I can become better at deciding. And over the years, I think I've also come to the conclusion that sometimes I just need to make a decision, you know, whether it's a big decision or small decision. Sometimes it's small decisions that I stress over, but I'd say, you know, when it came time to me deciding what to do beyond my last apartment, I think I knew what I was going to do, or I eventually came to that conclusion. Other people, when they're taking this test, they realize that they have areas they can work on and things they can do better to achieve their goals, or to just move forward in their goals and learn from the outcome. So I think that's a really important aspect of taking the Decide, Act, Believe test.
Yeah, and Ben's mentioning, we'll show you another slide in a little bit, that we actually have created an assessment called the Self-Determination Inventory that people can take that gives them a profile on where they are in these decide, act, and believe abilities. And it really can help identify what are the things that I'm really good at that I want to keep building on, and what are some things I might want to think more about.
Right.
As Ben mentioned, sometimes, and I know it's true for me too, when I have a lot of decisions, it's hard to really know which one I want to make. But how can you use that to understand yourself better? And so this is a framework that can create that common language to talk about our self-determination with friends, with family, with teachers, with other professionals, to really think about what this, how we can understand this and how we can better understand ourselves. And we know that thinking about self-determination is so important because there's a lot of data that suggests, a lot of research has really shown that people that are more self-determined have better outcomes while they're in school and as they transition into the world. Yeah, we appreciate, everyone knows this, right? But it's really important to have the research to show this so that we can really highlight, are there better ways that we can be doing this in systems to really make sure people are having these outcomes? So we know that increasing and supporting self-determination leads to better outcomes. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would have the house I have without self-determination. Not my cat, not my job, not my just activities that I do in my spare time, or things that I'll do, goals that I'll achieve or try to achieve in the future. None of that. And I think that is the case with, everyone here today, everyone who's ever been alive, since humankind first existed. I think, ask yourself sometimes, if someone else made, every decision for you, would you even be in this room today, or would you have the profession that you have today? I mean, it may not be the profession that you'll stay with for the rest of your life, or, some days you might work in a job for many, many years and decide, I do not want to work this kind of work. But once you realize that, once you start to do stuff based off that, and based off what you think is your key to contributing to this world and to yourself, then that is, I think, where self-determination proves itself to be so valuable, and why it's been such a valuable thing for people with disabilities for the last several decades, because for the last several centuries and millenniums, we have not been self-determined at all in most of the world.
Yeah. And we do want to emphasize, too, that self-determination, often we talk about it during transition, right, especially that transition from high school to adult life. But this really matters across the entire life course. So if you're really thinking about this for early childhood and young children, or even all the way up to supporting later adults as they're transitioning through retirement in those other areas, transitions happen across the life course. And self-determination is important in all of those areas. And there really are ways that we can talk about it and support it in each of those areas of life. And we're going to try to highlight some examples of ways that we're doing that and ways that we can make that happen.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else about the life course?
Yeah, I can say, well, I've been through childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and I guess middle adulthood is the bracket I'm in right now. But I can say that when I was in high school and deciding, what I wanted to do with my own life and where I was going to go after high school, being involved in things like my own IEP and going to those meetings, for me, as an autistic person, was essential. Without it, without that kind of input from me, I don't know that I would have any, I might have some kind of success that someone else chose for me, but it would be subpar to failing in something I chose for myself, to be perfectly honest.
So Ben and I want to share some ideas and resources and some of the things that we're working on at KUCDD in partnership with others. And so we think it's really important to have opportunities to actually talk to people with disabilities and with people with disabilities about self-determination and what it means to them. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You're hearing Ben share some of his stories. Stories are a really important part of this. But we've also tried to develop a way to get a picture of self-determination. And Ben mentioned this earlier when we talked about that decide, act, believe framework. So we've created something called the Self-Determination Inventory. And you can actually find it on our website, selfdetermination.org, but we've really focused here on trying to identify some of those key areas that are really important to self-determination. So being able to identify goals, making decisions, having the opportunities to make choices. And again, so that we can get a picture of what self-determination looks like for people and use that to ask questions of, are there different supports that we need? Are there really great areas? Ben mentioned being really good in that believe dimension.
Yeah.
And thinking about that. So we have a student report version of the self-determination inventory that can be used with adolescents into early adulthood to ask questions about self-determination. We have an adult report version, as well as a parent, teacher, and really any other reporter, where you can do this to try to provide input on what self-determination looks like for people. So right now, the tool, again, is available online. Anyone can actually log in and do it. It looks kind of like this, and again, this is small on the screen, but this is a snapshot of some of the items. So people go in and they're able to mark on the line where they feel about themselves in each of these areas. It has a lot of built-in accessibility features, things like progress bars so that people know how many items there are, this slider scale that you don't have to worry about if you're a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. You just mark where you feel about where you are on this. We've also embedded definitions so that people can really understand some of the key words. And all of this can be read aloud with examples for people that it might be easier to hear what's being asked rather than reading this. And so this is really meant to be a system that people can go in. It takes about 10 minutes to do the self-determination inventory. And at the end, it gives you a report or this picture of what your self-determination looks like. So this is just an example. Remember our Decide, Act, Believe framework that Ben introduced earlier? The person here scored highest in that act area and lowest in that believe area. And there's a lot of available teaching resources and support resources that you can then pull and look at that, oh, I might want to think about, are there different ways that I might support a person to believe more in this area? And Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about, in some of our projects where we work in the community with people with disabilities to talk about self-determination, we've used this assessment.
Yeah.
And what's that been like?
I think it's been for other people who have been taking this assessment, it's been very illuminating as to like I've said before, it's been illuminating as to what they do best, where they struggle and fall short. It's also, I think, just been a valuable way to move forward for so many people, realizing what they can improve on. And there are a number of skills, I know you probably can't all see them here, but there are a number of skills under Decide, Act, and Believe. I think 12 of them at least overall with about 4 or so under each one, actually, no, or about 4 under each one, but yeah, and if I were to learn more about those skills too, like the skills under Decide, I know I could definitely improve my Decide skills, be more fruitful, find more productiveness in all the different things I do, and and like we've said, this isn't any kind of either you pass or you fail this goal. It's not so much about that. It's just about, it's about learning, and through that learning, you can become more self-determined, as studies have shown multiple times in the better outcomes of people with disabilities and without disabilities who are more successful in their own endeavors.
Yeah, and we've worked hard to partner to make sure that we have, for example, an American Sign Language version of the tool available on the website. We partnered with the National Deaf Center to translate all the items and make that accessible. There's also a Spanish version of the tool available on our website, and we're working on several other translations so that this information is there. And what we've really learned from the research that we've done in creating this tool in partnership with the disability community and in testing it over time, unfortunately, we know that people with disabilities, particularly people with autism and people with intellectual disability, tend to score lower on the self-determination inventory than people without disabilities. Now, we do not believe that's because there's any lack of capacity for self-determination, but that's because of the lack of opportunities that can sometimes be present.
Definitely.
And do you want to talk a little bit about kind of expectations and some of the things that happened, especially in your early education?
Yeah. Well, I can relate to having throughout grade school. I can relate to the fact that people with any kind of disability have just expectations that are far lower than what they have of non-disabled students. And that could affect me throughout my grade school years. For many people with disabilities, it's affected them in grade school, kindergarten, middle school, high school, college, graduate school, any stage of life or any stage of education. And, when people treat you a certain way that's based on the fact that they don't have a whole lot of expectations of you, and that's kind of the whole life you're going through in school, it's how teachers and their lessons and their way they choose to teach you, it really starts to show in your outcomes. It can really it can make other students, they can pick up on what teachers are seeing. They can pick up on the fact that teachers have low expectations of you. They start to have such low expectations of you too, and that can lead to bullying, that can lead to things like increased risk of victimization from your peers, and it's just not, I think the only thing it really serves is continuing to make societies more ableist and less inclusive. And for people with disabilities, that's the last thing we need. Yeah.
And so we know that we have to take steps to change this. We also want to make sure that we highlight that we also know that especially when people are experiencing intersectionality and are also experiencing other forms of marginalization, we know that this can also impact self-determination. As Ben mentioned, that sometimes people do hold different expectations. And those different expectations can lead to these negative outcomes and reduce self-determination, which is what we're striving to promote and what we want to promote. It's just how do we do that? So how do we really think about exploring ways to support everyone to grow in that self-determination? And obviously, we think a big part of that is doing that in partnership, having voices like Ben and other members of our team helping us identify ways that we can do this. So we want to tell a little bit about some of the work that we're doing to actually make those changes. Not just to understand self-determination, even though that's a really important first step to be able to talk about it, but also how can we promote it? So we've kind of come up with this model that we often use when we're training other people and talking to them about self-determination, that we really want to teach skills and abilities that are really important. Many of us may kind of pick up problem-solving and decision-making skills, but wouldn't it be better if someone kind of helped us and guided us through how do you effectively use these and what are effective practices? But then we also need opportunities to use those skills. We need to have elementary classrooms where teachers have the expectations that students are using these skills and growing. And then we also need to figure out how to provide those supports and accommodations. So some people might need different means of communicating their self-determination. How do we put those pieces together? And Ben, do you want to share a little bit about the Kansas Navigator series and how we're trying to support people to get those teaching opportunities?
Sure. Yeah. So the Kansas Navigator series, one of the major components of it was self-determination. There were also other components that we could also spend a whole presentation talking about, like dignity of risk, circles of support, supported decision making. I think when they first started to learn about things like self-determination, they were just much more willing and able to go after goals, because again, this whole self-determination process isn't about doing things on your own, nor as we've said, is about achieving every goal. The fact of the matter is, as we mentioned, with having opportunities and supports and lessons to help teach these things, this is about things that we can start doing very early in people's school education and very early in people's upbringings that will ultimately, I think, lead to better success. Success that can come from having had many failures. In fact, success that is much more assured from having many failures. I think those two things actually kind of go hand in hand. If you were to read research on people who've accomplished big things and see how many times they have failed in something they tried.
Yeah, and so the Kansas Navigator series, Ben actually recorded a series of videos, and we made some kind of informational sheets and other resources so that people could learn about these decide, act, believe areas. And then you got together with groups of young adults. They were high schoolers and young adults with autism and other disabilities to talk about these things so that Ben could share how he'd navigated through all of those areas.
Right.
And do you want to share anything about what those groups were like?
I think, as we were leading these groups, I just saw a whole lot more motivation from people to go after things that they want in their lives and to be more self-determined, for better or worse in terms of the outcome. I hear some of the quotes people have said about the Kansas Navigator series, as well as the Saga Project, and I guess also to a certain extent other studies I've been in while I've been at KU-CDD, and you just see a remarkably different outcome that these students and these participants just didn't have before. So this is a big reason why we teach self-determination, partially so people can learn skills associated with success, partially so we can do things like alleviate the gaps in outcomes between people with and without disabilities. But as we move forward with all these different projects, we're seeing we're seeing something again and again, and that is that self-determination is a key component no matter who you are or where you are in your life.
And one of the approaches that we've developed, and we'll also talk more in one of the afternoon workshops about the self-determined learning model of instruction, but we wanted to just show you this process that we're using to have those conversations with people with disabilities and teach these self-determination skills. And it's really all about thinking about identifying a goal, asking people that question of what is your goal for the future? And then thinking about what is the plan that you can implement and test to figure out how to try to take steps towards that goal. And then it's all about asking that question, as Ben's mentioned, what have I learned? If I didn't achieve my goal, what did I learn about myself? What did I learn that might need to change about a different goal? And we could spend the whole day talking to you about how we can implement this approach and all the resources that are out there to do this. But as a teacher that we have worked with that implements this model, as she said, it's all about changing how we're asking the question.
Right.
That's the real focus here. It's all about how we ask the question. Do we tell people what their goals are, what their action plans are, and what they've learned? Or do we flip that model, especially because too often people with disabilities have been told what their goals are and what they should be doing, rather than being enabled to ask that question for themselves and to have those opportunities to sometimes make a mistake and for that to be okay and a really good learning opportunity. So that's what the SDLMI and these approaches that we're trying to teach young people through the Kansas Navigator series or other work that we're doing in schools with other community organizations is all about. How do we change how we ask that question?
Yeah.
And is there anything else you want to say about any of the projects?
Oh, I can just say, we'll get into numbers fairly soon and how numbers are supporting us in ideas like self-determination and self-determination skills. But it's partially for me when I actually work with the individual people to make them learn things like choice making, decision making, things where we can take the tests people have taken and learn how to make them better. Things like decision makers, choice makers, self-regulators. And it's when you see that in our own studies, within our own studies, to say nothing of studies in general, that we're seeing people who are starting to feel enhanced outcomes in their lives. That's kind of something I can connect that very well to what we're seeing about self-determination as a whole. Being someone who's been in the situation of a facilitator and has looked at how many people have said things like, I had this much progress on my goal, much less than expected, expected much more, and how much are in that third bracket or above. It feels great to see people learn stuff about like their process to achieve their goals, even if it's like, okay, I won't fall asleep on the job, which I know some of us here are probably thinking, well, that's just a given. But this person just made a huge step in achieving something they want to do. They're immeasurably closer to achieving any kind of goal than they were just before these sessions started. And so, yeah, we see this in the numbers of studies in general, but this has just been kind of our experience as facilitators and working with these students.
Yeah, and Ben mentioned the numbers, so I do have a numbers slide that I'll put up next, that this model, this self-determined learning model of instruction and shifting how we ask that question, there's a lot of research, as Ben mentioned, to show it really makes a difference. But one of the things I really want to emphasize is that a lot of this research, we had, and I'm going to use my air quotes here, we had professionals implementing the interventions. And that may be educators, other community leaders, and those people are a very important part of implementation. But what we're learning and what we're finding is that by really pushing to have people with lived experience as co-implementers and doing these interventions together to share those experiences. So Ben's mentioned he's served as a facilitator of self-determination instruction in the community. He's now training teachers on how to implement this instruction in their classrooms, because that lived experience of how did you navigate these
Right.
numbers? How did you do these things? Is so much more powerful, and we're seeing really positive outcomes of this, including better impacts. So that's really a direction that we're including in kind of this work as to how we move this forward. So really, the SDLMI does involve having a facilitator that supports how we ask this question. That can be Ben, that can be anyone else that kind of learns how to support people. We teach people a series of questions asking about what is that goal, what is that action plan, and we build a lot of supports up around that. How do you think about what it means to make a decision? How do you identify the process that works best for you? And how can we do this in a way that's really impactful? And so we just wanted to highlight and share a few things, and Ben and I will be around if you have questions, because we don't have time to go into all of this in a lot of depth, but we've worked to develop a lot of different implementation materials that help us figure out how to ask these questions differently, that help Ben and others to support groups of people in the community to be talking about these things together, to be thinking about how educators, how healthcare professionals and others are really thinking about how we change, how we're asking these questions. So there's a lot of resources, and we're trying to leverage some of these areas that we know about. For example, we have a project that we're doing right now called the Propel Project.
Yeah.
That's all about taking this idea of how do we teach self-determination skills, but building in peer supports to this. Because of what Ben mentioned earlier about how important peers' expectations were and how sometimes that was shaped. So in this project, we're really supporting reciprocal peer support and empowering people with and without disabilities to work together to identify shared goals and support each other.
Definitely.
Is there anything else you want to add about bringing the peers into this?
I think that covers a lot as of this moment. I can't think of anything else to add right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been very lucky. We're working in a number of schools and have trained a number of educators in how to use this approach to build self-determination skills across adolescents with and without autism to really make this something that's a part of that classroom experience and planning for that transition. We've also been able to support students still in high school, but to work across general education and special education to be supporting students to think about self-determination skills and this goal setting as just a part of the curriculum, right? Having goals for what you're learning, doesn't that sound important? But how often are people actually identifying those goals? And so you can see there's a word cloud at the bottom. There's a really big grades. That was kind of the biggest goal area that students wanted to work on, was improving those grades. But we really were seeing that all students were growing in these self-determination abilities and doing this together in these inclusive spaces.
Yeah.
And we also mentioned earlier how important this is across the life course. So we're also thinking about how we could take this idea of self-determination that's often been talked about with older students, so adolescents and in young adulthood, and break this down in elementary school. So we're embedding now the SDLMI in elementary school.
Yeah, it can be, I think people can start with this at pretty much any stage. Is, when you ask what's the best time to start this, I just think, now is as good a time as ever, any. Actually, now is a better time than any, and we'll see the results for a long time to come.
Yeah, and so again, thinking about these transitions across the life course, starting early, but planning for that meaningful life is the ultimate goal. And kids are loving it. We've got some student reactions up here from a first kind of pilot of doing this with 4th and 5th graders when they're in elementary school. So it's helping them identify their strengths. It's helping them focus on setting a goal and starting to build that vocabulary early on for what this means. to live a self-determined life.
Right.
We're also really thinking about different ways that technology can enhance self-determination.
Yeah.
We've been really lucky to be able to build, and it'll be available relatively soon, a way for an app to support students to go through the self-determined learning model of instruction. And so this is just a different way to support more people to engage in self-determination and go through this process and these steps that we know can have a real impact for students.
Definitely.
And we don't want to miss the importance either of building those family connections for self-determination.
No.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why making sure families are involved in supporting self-determination is so important?
Well, I mean, your families, they're often the people who spend, the most time around you. Of all the people you meet in your life up to a certain age in your life, they are people who will understand. They are also people who can give a lot of insight into what you struggle with, what you strive with. And we've had families help complete some of our post and pre-survey assessments in the SDLMI studies that we've done, and we found that these submissions from the families were able to corroborate what we were learning from the students in their assessments. But I think, going back on that point, that no one does anything completely independently. No one's an island of some kind. Families are probably one of the key people you can find for supports in learning these self-determination skills. And they can do things like model self-determination skills for relatives. They might have many experiences of using or struggling to use such skills. I can see that kind of in my family too. My family was like I've said before, had some great impact on the fact that I can consider myself today self-determined. So I think, families are very much a critical part of self-determination. Yeah, right, definitely.
And I think we want to focus on how we can try to support families to know about these practices and support self-determination as an outcome for people. Right. So we want to just emphasize what we do know from research on promoting self-determination. So there is no question, remember we had the slide, there's all of these studies on the SDLMI, there's all of this work. People with disabilities, with any disability, with any range of support needs, can learn and practice these skills with supports and opportunities, and it leads to better outcomes. But it's all about figuring out how we make effective assessment, instruction available and accessible for people. And we'll really emphasize how we push that forward so that we're doing this inclusively, so that it is people with and without lived experience coming together to do this, to share this information, and to move it forward. Because ultimately, families, people with disabilities themselves have to be at the center of this, of these transitions, of establishing that meaningful life.
Yeah.
And so we just wanted to put up a quote on this screen that has really resonated with us, that a young person that was in one of our studies shared, that working on self-determination has opened my eyes that I could do it, but also opened a lot of other eyes. And so this goes back then, right, to what you were sharing about those expectations.
Right.
About how we really want to change those expectations and that culture to really believe that self-determination can be a reality for everyone.
Yeah.
And so we're going to just quickly close by saying that one of the reasons that we've gotten to this point in the work that we're doing and able to share the self-determination inventory, the self-determined learning model of instruction, is because of our real focus on inclusive research, how we're developing these interventions, how we're disseminating them, also inclusive policy and practice.
Definitely.
And to us, that means that we're trying to center the voices, experience, and expertise of people with disabilities as we're developing research to try to identify these practices, as we're conducting it, and as we're sharing it. Because we really believe that's what leads to self-determination and other outcomes that are valued by the disability community. So that's really the main focus of what we're trying to do in our work.
Right.
And what we hope can continue to shape how others are doing research and practice to really elevate that expertise. Is there anything else you want to share about inclusive research?
All I can say is, look at your research teams, look at the kind of research you're doing, and, every once in a while, take a quick moment and just kind of ask yourself some questions about who might be on that team and why they're on that team and why some are not on that team too. And, when you find those answers, just do what you can with those answers. See if you can maybe make your research better, because you'll find a lot of the times your research is not testing it the right way, or the question that you're asking, or maybe that you're asking the wrong question too. So just being mindful of the overall composition of a research team, I think, is just first foundational step to an inclusive research project that will make research more inclusive as time in the history of research continues on.
And we want to emphasize that that's really important in research, but it's also important in practice,
Right.
in the work that we're doing in the community.
Right.
And so this idea of being inclusive and how we're thinking about implementing supports, testing supports, developing them, that's just essential to
Definitely.
everything that we're doing.
100%.
Here in California, the vehicle for carrying out self-determination is through our regional center system. And how is it carried out in your state?
Yeah, that's a great question. And California has the regional systems. We've actually interacted with some of those over time. So it is a little bit different in Kansas. We don't have the same regional system. By and large, we're a much smaller state, so there's not as much need for kind of that regional work. We do a lot of work directly through some of our state departments, both the Developmental Disability Services, to think about how to embed these practices into supports, as well as through local schools and districts for what we're doing.
Another question for you both would be, how can we support self-determination in young children, for instance, early or middle childhood, when maybe they need a bit more guidance? How do we balance supports and autonomy and give more control while also supporting their goals?
Do you have any thoughts on supporting younger students?
Well, I'd say, maybe learn a little bit about how they work best, how they function best. And you might just ask them, you might just try to get something out of them, like, you might try to learn from them, like, how can you turn in assignments on time, complete assignments, find out from them things like, are they struggling from something, or just try to be mindful of, where they might be on certain issues in their school career and their just life overall, and work on goals. Be sure you can work on goals together too.
Yeah, and I'll just add that one of the things that we really learned from taking some of our interventions developed for older students and kind of supporting younger students with them is just what Ben said, that scaffolding. How do you make it a little bit more concrete, build some of that vocabulary and provide more structure, but still have that focus on what are those goals and how do we really start to think about them.
We have a question about teaching self-determination for kids with expressive and receptive language delays, non-speakers, or limited verbal skills.
I guess I can't think of anything at the moment except, use what, you might have some idea about how you might communicate with them and, definitely use that idea. I can't think of anything right at this specific moment, but Karrie, I guess you might have something to add.
Yeah, one of the members of our inclusive team primarily uses a communication device. And so we've worked with him to build a guide for supporting people with complex communication-related needs, to think about how you can identify core vocabulary, program it in devices, or think about alternative ways to identify these core areas that we're really talking about. Goals, how to navigate around barriers, and to really think about how to make that meaningful and accessible. It's a critically important area, and it's building those supports, and we're really trying to partner to identify some of the most effective ways to do that.
So this is a follow-up, because I think you might get this later. That guide you developed, is that available to the public?
Yes, and I will say that our website, we had it in there somewhere, selfdetermination.org. You can find more resources on all of these, and we're happy to connect with you and figure out how to get you access to what you need.
That's great. I have a question here specific to the healthcare setting. So many young people with disabilities that are interviewed in a healthcare setting often struggle with being able to articulate their goals. And this person gets a lot of maybe shrugs or I don't know. So what are your recommendations? How do we ask questions in a different way to increase engagement and partnership?
I guess depending on kind of what your relationship with them is, I've personally had struggles expressing goals. I know in my head, sometimes the more complicated a goal is, the more I might find struggle with it, but just to I think it's good to kind of absorb people, see kind of where, a lot of their focus tends to be when they're not doing things out of purely out of obligations, like when they're not doing their school and they're not doing their work. Maybe try to find, think of a way that they could, think of what frame of reference they might lack, or how they might not be able to articulate such concepts that might be kind of big for them. I've worked on concepts that, goals, kind of around concepts that are it's kind of something I can't quite describe, succinctly, or I might really kind of struggle to explain it in a way that other people can understand. But the more I learn about, other things, maybe things like what I'm doing, the more I can kind of give people, their own frame of reference for what they might, for one that they might use, and help them to sort of understand what I'm trying to accomplish a little better.
Yeah, and I think we've talked to others, especially in healthcare spaces, right? Things are very fast. There's not a lot of time.
Right.
But as Ben's saying, sometimes it takes time, right?
Right.
If I were to go around and ask each of you, what's your goal for today? It might be a little bit hard to immediately answer that.
Right.
So we've been thinking about, is there kind of support that can be provided,
Definitely.
asking to think about these areas, or that maybe that's a discussion that you then come back to at a subsequent visit, or things along those lines. Because again, think about being in that moment of, well, what's your goal? If you haven't done that pre-work, you're not going to be able to meaningfully answer that question.
Right.
And that's a critically important part of the processes we're talking about.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll try to see in here. Ideas or strategies about how educators or providers can use the self-determination interview within the special education evaluation process and how it informs goals.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can jump in first. We actually have now several either school districts, we're partnering with a couple of state departments of education that are actually embedding this into kind of their IEP and transition planning process. It's an assessment of strengths and areas of need, so it can actually be used as part of that process, and especially for transition planning, because it is a validated tool, it really can be used there and used to inform those goals and guide some of those conversations, right?
Right.
You mentioned how important that can be to have the person be a part of their IEP.
Right.
And this is a way to do that.
Have you found in your research that colleges and universities with research centers such as yours attract students with developmental disabilities in addition to faculty and staff?
I think what students will want to know is that they can find kind of a place where they can feel supportive. Sometimes throughout the country, across the country, there are things like there's a disability student group at a number of colleges I think there's a few I can think of right off the bat. One at my old alma mater. There's also from my undergrad, when I was an undergraduate. I think there's a neurodivergent student union also at the place where I was a graduate student. And I keep hearing a number of different clubs and organizations that are rising up across the country. I mean, that's one way. Or maybe if people know there's an environment they can find that will welcome them. Or maybe if they can, be assured that they'll meet people who are inclusive and understanding and are in the spirit of being accessible. That sometimes can come a long way. I think there's probably a lot more about this that I can't really think of at the moment, but those are just a few thoughts I have that might come up to me. I mean, they might look at college and think, okay, this is probably going to be my best bet and hopefully they're not, choosing the best of 1,000 bad options, or maybe they won't. Maybe hopefully that's not the message you're promoting. But I think leadership of schools can definitely go a long way. If they really commit to things like inclusivity and diversity and equity, those things can reflect on other segments and other levels of the school to a very high degree.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add that it really is building that culture of inclusion. It is something that we've really strove for at our center. We often get people kind of coming and asking us even to do trainings on how do you build that culture, and our biggest advice is always start from that foundation of, all means all. Inclusion is inclusion. We're not layering on, we're not adding on. That is where we're starting from, that we all bring different strengths, but how can we bring those together in a way that leads to better outcomes? And I do think that really can lead to more people reaching out and wanting to have training opportunities or research opportunities or to grow and develop in those areas. So we hope that we're able to be building some of those resources.
Sure.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.